Today's social system in the United States is often called capitalism. And capitalism is often blamed for the world's problems. But what deserves blame in these cases and many others is not capitalism, because capitalism doesn't exist today, neither in the United States nor anywhere else. This is a perspective I learned from Ayn Rand, who, in addition to her famous novels Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, published a book titled Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, the lead essay of which is titled, What is Capitalism? But if capitalism doesn't exist today, according to Rand, what exactly is capitalism on her view? That's what I'll discuss in this video. The basic principle governing a capitalist system, on Rand's view, is that people should interact with each other in a voluntary, non-coercive way. A voluntary interaction could be, for example, a merchant exchanging goods with buyers at a market at an agreed upon price, or asking someone to make a donation to some cause. A coercive interaction could be, for example, mugging, raping, or murdering someone. Whereas voluntary interactions are consensual, coercive interactions are not. The mugger, rapist, and murderer do not seek the consent of the people they interact with. They simply impose their will on their victims through physical force, or the threat of physical force. In opposing force or coercion, what Rand is opposing, more specifically, is the initiation of force. She fully supports the use of force in retaliation against those who initiate its use. When police use force to arrest and imprison a mugger, they are using retaliatory force in response to the mugger's initiation of force against his victim. When a peaceful country's military responds with force to an aggressor country's attack, it is using retaliatory force. The proper role of government, in Rand's view, is to protect individuals from the initiation of force. It does this by means of the police and military, and also by means of a court system, which helps people settle their disputes peacefully without resorting to force. But instead of protecting individuals from force, the government itself initiates force against individuals when it enslaves, taxes, or regulates them. We've gotten rid of slavery in the United States, but we have taxation and regulation, lots of it. Taxation forcibly takes people's money away, not money they have obtained through force, but money they obtained through voluntary means, such as by working a job or starting a business and earning a profit. Regulations forcibly stop people from acting in ways that involve no coercion. For instance, an employer might want to run his business without offering a health insurance plan to his employees and perhaps pay them more than he could afford to if he offered the plan. But a labor regulation might forbid him from doing so, even though he forces no one by not offering the health insurance plan. Under capitalism, as Rand conceives it, there are no taxes or regulations, since they involve coercing people. Let's now consider some further implications of this. Without taxes, there would be no tax-funded programs such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public education, and food stamps. This doesn't mean people would have no retirement programs, healthcare, schools, or food. It just means that such goods and services could only be obtained through voluntary, non-coercive means. If you want money for retirement, healthcare, education, or food, you need to save or budget for it. You can't count on others being forced to pay for your needs. As for the tiny percentage of people, and I do think the percentage is tiny, who cannot support themselves in a free market, they'll need to rely on private voluntary charity. There will be no coercive government welfare programs that force some to support others. Likewise, there will be no corporate welfare that forces people to bail out businesses. Every business would have to compete on a free market without any subsidies, tariffs, or other special favors from the government. Laborers, too, would have to compete on a free market without any coercion to help them, in the form, for instance, of government-backed unions. Employers would be free to hire and fire as they choose, as long as they honor their contracts. This would include the ability to hire immigrants who would not be forcibly stopped from coming here to live and work. And they would have to work, unless they have some independent means of support, since there would be no government welfare for them to rely on. Since there are no regulations under capitalism, as Rand conceives it, this means there would be no regulatory agencies, such as the FDA, SEC, OSHA, EPA, FCC, and FAA. This doesn't mean businesses could do whatever they want and get away with it. It just means they would be free to do whatever they want, so long as they don't resort to force or fraud in dealing with others, so long as they relate to others in a voluntary way. And private non-governmental rating agencies and review forums, such as Yelp, could help people decide which businesses to patronize and which to avoid. Reputation matters on a free market, and companies would have a self-interested financial incentive to earn a good one through good and honest work. Now I want to say a bit about government funding, because it's often asked how a government would be funded if there are no compulsory taxes. If you think it's unlikely that voluntary methods would generate sufficient revenue to fund the government, I would agree with you, if you're talking about today's government. But I think today's government is massively overgrown and far from capitalist. If the government were cut down to what I think is its proper size and function, if there were no massive regulatory bureaucracy to fund, if there were no multi-billion or trillion-dollar government programs like Social Security, Medicare, and public education, if the only government functions were police, military, and courts, which is about all there should be on Rand's view, the government would be much easier to fund in a voluntary way. And even the funding needed for police, military, and courts would be radically different if those institutions were restricted to what I think is their proper role, protecting individuals from force. For instance, the military would only engage in wars of self-defense, and its operations would consist of swiftly and decisively defeating the enemy, not hanging around for years or decades to engage in multi-billion-dollar projects of nation building. Nor would billions of dollars be spent on a war on drugs, at home and abroad, in order to stop adults from voluntarily using drugs. Drugs would be legal, just as alcohol is, or at least has been since the repeal of prohibition. Forcibly stopping adults from producing, selling, possessing, or using drugs or alcohol, and then imprisoning them, reverses the proper function of the police or military, turning them into initiators of force rather than retaliators. If the government's functions were restricted in the ways I've mentioned, I think funding it by voluntary means would be quite easy. As Rand writes in her article, Government Financing in a Free Society, in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, quote, since the proper services of a government, the police, the armed forces, the law courts, are demonstrably needed by individual citizens and affect their interests directly. The citizens would and should be willing to pay for such services, as they pay for insurance. Unquote. Donations and lotteries are two possibilities for how such services could be paid for. Paying the government to enforce contracts is another possibility, which Rand discusses in her article. There she also discusses the issue of free riders, that is, people who might benefit from government services without paying for them, and she argues that they would not be a problem. The voluntary system that Rand advocates, or at least something much closer to it, is the sort of system that existed in late 19th century America. That was a period of tremendous growth and progress, during which millions of immigrants came here for a better life, seeking more freedom and opportunity. Had America stuck with that sort of voluntary system, rather than introducing a large amount of government coercion via such programs as FDR's New Deal or Lyndon Johnson's so-called Great Society, we would, in my view, be much better off than we are today. Because freedom, not coercion, is the road to prosperity.